the Rajapaksa regime and the government were in fact the United Nations guys. They were the people who drew the attention of the world to what was going on in the northern part of Sri Lanka.
Yeah, but on the record, my book clarifies that the UN agencies and the international NGOs did not do as much as they could. And in fact, you're right in the sense that the state was, if at all you had to have a scale of measurement, the state committed more abuses and atrocities than the guerrillas. But within the entity controlled territories, which I had plenty of access to, it was also a reign of terror.
So you had two sets of oppressors.
Yeah.
Who was the lesser evil? And can you really say that the army was the lesser evil?
I think, the entity was preparing the Tamil-speaking people of the north and east for a kind of a militant nationhood and a militant nation state that could not have been stable. It was heading towards authoritarian statehood, if at all it had ever succeeded. So I don't think it was really a choice. It was like between the devil and the deep sea. Civilians, especially Tamil-speaking ones in the north and east, were caught, sandwiched, and being crushed relentlessly. And I saw it day and out. I mean, so much violence and so fresh when you see corpses lying on the highways and off the highways in the villages, people disappearing every single day, and then there are factions, and it became a Colombia-like situation towards the end where you didn't know who was killing whom. So in this kind of violent, generalized environment of violence, the aid agencies could have done a lot more. And my argument is that they failed the civilians of Sri Lanka grossly by virtue of power and ideas. In fact, that's the subtitle of the book. But power, I mean, of course, the pressures they faced, both from the host government, the guerrillas who were very demanding. I remember days when the local NPP chiefs used to summon all the aid agency heads of a district to turn up and show the records, and then they would ask them, why are you not doing development projects in this region, in this district or in this village rather than this one? And their motive was clearly military and strategic, to gain a foothold and to drive out the armed forces. And the armed forces would do the same. In districts like Trincomalee, you had the military practically running the administration, and they would have their own set of diktats and commands for the aid agencies. So yes, the aid agencies were constrained, but my book argues that it goes beyond that. It's not just about facing these material pressures and power and inducements from more powerful actors. It's also about their own bureaucratic self-understandings, their internal culture, and their conservative values. Mm-hmm. And I've actually laid out how they could turn more, but they failed the people of Sri Lanka because of these cultural and bureaucratic routines and standard operating procedures.
Deeply ingrained.
And very dehumanizing. If you go back to Hannah Arendt, how bureaucracy, looks at the person across the desk from a point of view of a statistic. So you can provide somebody, a tent or a piece of, oral rehydration packet, but you cannot provide this person protection. You can do it, and I've shown how some ingenious organizations have managed to overcome the bureaucratic routines. But the norm was that the aid agencies failed people, and I believe they could have been more proactive. And I've defined proactiveness in the book a lot, and I've given lots of examples. And they failed there because, I believe, not so much because of the material pressures. The material pressures were there. Why was UNICEF so proactive, for instance, as opposed to Save the Children? It should be the converse, because an NGO is supposed to be freer than a UN agency in terms of expressing its views and in terms of acting on the norm. But my book shows that in Sri Lanka, in fact, Save the Children was more conservative than UNICEF. UNICEF transformed over time, and I've shown how that happens. And unfortunately, it comes down to the point that it's some key individuals who are very, very conscientious, who continue to work in these organizations. And they are the ones who can push it in a direction that is proactive. Otherwise, the general tendency is to be overcautious, extremely conservative, and sometimes cozying up to both the guerrillas and the state, to the point that you become accomplices in this war against the people.
Dr. Cholia, if you can briefly comment on the situation you saw in the Philippines, in the Mindanao area, Mindanao province, and just compare and contrast it with the situation in Sri Lanka.
It's a bloodier war because it's still continuing, and what's happened over the last 40, 50 years is marginalization of the the Bangsamoro people, the natives of this region, and encroachment by the what is perceived as Christian crusaders. So from the Spanish conquest downwards, we have seen this happening, and now you have, in fact, in many ways, Mindanao is comparable to Tibet, because Tibetans find themselves increasingly becoming a minority in their own lands. The same thing is happening. So it's a demographic assault, much more organized than what you have in Sri Lanka. But the difference is that the guerrillas are far more sophisticated than the entity was. And I've shown how so. They're much more decentralized, less authoritarian, and have won over people with the ideology of some kind of defensive jihad against the Christian crusaders. But what is interesting is how this translates into protection of civilians. And frankly speaking, the Philippines Mindanao undergoes waves and waves of wars. I mean, we've had 4 Ilam wars and then full stop. Prabhakaran is killed. It's over. But here you had like probably 10 wars and then quasi-wars, and they continue to happen. And I have actually shown how that has been exacerbated by the US war on terror and the American intervention, which has actually strengthened the hand of the Philippine armed forces and their local affiliates to go berserk and to actually engage in far more heinous crimes against humanity than was the case before 2001. So here you have a case where there's supposedly a local war that has been aggravated through internationalization and the global war on terror. And therefore I use the word the terror of war rather than the war on terror. So this is where the tragedy of the Philippines is tied into geopolitics of the region, containment of China, American presence in Southeast Asia and all that.
Okay. I have with me here in the studio of Lok Sabha Television the author of this book. It's called International Organizations and Civilian Protection. The subtitle is Power, Ideas and Humanitarian Aid in Conflict Zones. The author of the book is Professor Sriram Sundar Cholia. He's Vice Dean at the Jindal School of International Affairs at the OP Jindal Global University in Sonipat, Haryana. With us here is Bijoy Basant Patru, journalist, commentator, writer on humanitarian issues, development issues, has worked with the International Federation of the Red Cross, worked all over South Asia. Dr. Cholia, these words, might and morality, are they really two sides of the same coin? Or are you sort of indulging in semantics? I mean, you have taken on all those academics, laypersons included, who have believed that these international humanitarian organizations are doing good work. And your kind of criticism, it's ideological. You say that others are liberal, but you are being illiberal by the kind of criticism you're doing of organizations who are trying to help people who are in desperate need of succor, of material help. As you can see, no country is free of that, whether it be the United States of America in New Orleans after the cyclone, or Myanmar after a natural calamity.
Yeah, see, the reason we have might and morality mixed up is because of the internationalization, or let's say globalization of the liberal ethos. The liberal spirit is basically one which represents material interests, but tries to cloak them and put on this elaborate charade of doing good and saving lives. And I believe this is very much tied to the capitalist world system, as I showed towards the end of the book, and to patriarchy and such big structural conditions. And the aid agencies, I argue, represent one cog in this wheel of the capitalist world system and of patriarchy. And they are in many ways manifestations of it. Where do donors come from? Where do you generate charity? Where do you generate empathy and so-called sympathy? Why not let people struggle, strive, and end their own wars? Why do you need saviors from outside? In that sense, in fact, I've pointed out cases where aid agencies are actually sales fronts for a number of corporations, especially in the agriculture industry. World Food Program is like a God-sent gift for a number of biotechnology firms, because it often becomes a conduit for introducing new crops and methods.
Okay, Dr. Cholia, we are sort of nearing the end of our conversation. I'd like you to talk a little bit why in your book you emphasize these concepts of power and ideas, and why you believe that these combine within larger structural conditions to cause and to influence humanitarian behavior towards civilians. And I'd also like you to really talk a little bit about how these international humanitarian organizations need to change so that they work more closely with civil society organizations at the grassroots levels.
The heroes of this book are basically the courageous individuals and groups which are self-organized at the grassroots level in the war-affected areas. What they have shown is that they don't need donors, they don't need grants, they don't need projects, they don't need proposals to protect their own communities and to create environment which
they can look after themselves. And in looking after themselves, if the international humanitarian organization strengthens these bodies, then they'll be doing a proper service.
Absolutely. In fact, I think I have always argued that we need to move beyond the paradigm of humanitarianism. We have to talk about peace. The aid agencies never talk about it because they say it's too political. Let's not talk about solutions. We are only here to do band-aid. Right? The aid agencies will have to eventually either close shop or start working with local people to create an environment which the culture of fear is overcome and the culture of terror is overcome, and which we have genuine, the aid agencies often use terms like zones of peace, but I've shown that these are often shams, beneath which weapons are smuggled and where violence continues. We need genuine zones of peace which are buttressed by international solidarity, civilian peacekeeping, as opposed to the UN war barracks.
Okay.
So I've given a number of alternatives to this developmentalist and material aid-based approach of the aid agencies.
Unfortunately, run out of time. Thank you so much for coming here, Professor Chawla. Thank you so much for coming here. Thank you once again. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you just heard a discussion on whether international humanitarian aid has become a racket. How do international humanitarian organizations, how do they need to change, to evolve, so that they do not replicate exploitative structures, but truly work towards not just providing temporary succor, but a just and a humane society. Thank you so much for being with us on this program.